Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 9. Hope everybody's doing well. A few announcements to get us started. First, I got your midterms. Don't freak out if your grade is a 40 or a 50, maybe, because I haven't had a chance to grade your short essay questions. So I have to go in by hand and do that. I'm traveling to a conference over this weekend, so I probably won't be able to get to it before this weekend, but I'll definitely have them done by next week. So I'll try to get those done as soon as possible. I've posted new discussion groups, so you guys are actually going to be switching up the groups you've been doing the discussions in this week. And I posted the new discussion group list. It's under files and group assignments. So if you look at discussion group 2, it will tell you which group that you're in and you need to participate in. Also, I had some people comment in this previous discussion that they were having a hard time following the podcast, and they were actually interested in reading the material as well. So I went ahead and posted a full PDF version of Leviathan by Hobbes and a PDF version of Locke's Second Treatise of Government. So these are handy to have, even if you're not going to read them now. You may want to download them and just keep them, or you can find them on the internet. That's what I did. So maybe actually, so I included the podcast. I'm sitting on my yoga ball. Sorry, I'm bouncing. I decided to use the podcast because a couple of students had told me they wanted to actually mix up the different kinds of media. Some people wanted videos, some wanted reading, some wanted podcasts. So I thought I'd try the podcasts. But why don't you guys, if you have a strong feeling one way or another, respond to this particular announcement of whether you'd prefer a podcast, whether you'd prefer reading, whether you want to mix it up, which is what I was intending to do. But if you don't really like this guy that I'm using for this podcast, he's pretty good. He covers a lot of the same material that I was going to talk about. Let me know, and we can go back to the reading, and you guys can listen to me drone on about the topic after we read it. So, yeah, if you have strong feelings, just comment in response to this particular announcement that I'm making. Okay, so this past week we were looking at our good man Hobbes, right, who has a slightly pessimistic but perhaps realistic view on human life, human behavior, human politics, and where it leads us as far as the role that government should play, right? So we have to remember we've evolved quite a bit, right? Perhaps if we go back, we could even be coming slightly full circle if we consider, we started with Lycurgus, who was, sort of forcing people through the rule of law to be equals for the most part. He wanted to sort of an egalitarian society. And then we had, Plato coming along, who was talking about the importance of following the rule of law and a social contract, which also Hobbes, Hobbes is often credited as sort of the modern author of the social contract theory with his, sovereign state that he talks about in Leviathan. But, of course, it's important to remember that passage that we read in Crito, where where Socrates is arguing for a type of social contract theory by saying that we need to obey the rules and obey the laws because, the society this is a society we're born in, they've taken care of us, etc. Therefore, we have this obligation to follow those laws. So I would argue that, social contract theory goes way back, at least to Plato, probably before. And, we have this departure, right, where we're looking at Aristotle. And Aristotle was the man for a long time, right? People believed that Aristotle had gotten it right. And it all goes back, all these distinctions go back to what is how are we defining human beings? And what are the primary things that drive human behavior? Aristotle had what's called a teleological view of human nature, right? So people aim towards a goal. They have an ultimate end in mind, and that's what drives their behavior. So for Aristotle, that ultimate goal that people were aiming towards was happiness, right? Human flourishing. And all the activities of the state should be designed in such a way to ensure that people have the maximum opportunity to pursue human flourishing or happiness, right? So, so that's Aristotle's view, and that's it. And based on that particular conception, that's how Aristotle thought that the state should be designed. Well, fast forward, 1,500, 1,700 years, and then we have Machiavelli, who we looked at last week, coming along saying, Aristotle's living in a dream world, right? This idea of, this utopian society where people, pursue what's good for them, and man is a political animal, which Aristotle just meant by that man is a social animal, right? We're not isolated entities, sort of islands unto ourselves, but rather that, the way that we interact, or the way that we live, is by interacting with other people in political communities, right? So in a lot of ways, Aristotle was taking the opposing viewpoint to Machiavelli and Hobbes, who had a very individualistic sort of initial conception of human beings, right? And where we are, at least in this, state of nature, let's say, right? So Aristotle, rather than saying that we're individuals, Aristotle was saying that we're actually communal by nature. So Machiavelli comes along and says, look, this is BS. I'd rather look at things the way they are, rather than the way that, we would like for them to be. And, it's dog eat dog. And, you need to utilize all these political stratagems to make sure that you're taking care of yourself, make sure that you're staying in power. You need to know how to conduct war, how to wage war. It's better to be cruel than to be clement. Don't spend your money unless it's somebody else's money. Then you spend it. All these very politically and individually expedient things, right? Which is quite the opposite of the view that Aristotle propounds. Okay, so all that is preface. Sorry, rambling a little bit there. So then Hobbes comes along, right? And Hobbes, in a way, is trying to sort of legitimize, in some ways, what Machiavelli is saying. He's trying to take Machiavelli's insights about what human nature actually is, which really goes back to Thrasymachus again, right? So Machiavelli's not really saying anything new. He's just spouting the opposing viewpoint that, Socrates refuted in the Republic. So whether this is actually some novel account that the classics never considered is probably not true. But anyway, right, so here comes Hobbes to try to sort of put a system into place that, describes really provides a sort of a philosophical foundation for Machiavelli's account of man and the role that politics should play in that particular system. Okay, so before we actually get into Hobbes's theory, the state of nature and the state of war and the Leviathan, we should think about context, right? Because when you're looking at a political thinker, or any thinker for that matter, you have to consider the context in which that particular work or that particular person lived, right? So two huge things come out for Hobbes. One was that he lived in a time of incredible political turmoil in the United Kingdom, in England, right? He lived through the English Civil War, where Oliver Cromwell and his Roundheads were, essentially taking over Parliament and the English government because of corruption and things like that. So he lived through this 30-year awful Civil War, right? So this very much shaped, and he lived through the aftermath as well, which is going to be important later. So he lived through this awful time, right? So that definitely shaped his notions of what an ideal state looks like, what mankind is actually like. I mean, if you're living in a time of relative prosperity, as Aristotle and Plato did, it's very different than growing up in a time where there is perpetual civil war actually going on around you, right? So that's number one thing that's important to know about Hobbes. Number two is that Hobbes was coming in around the time of the Enlightenment. He was coming in at the very beginning of the Enlightenment, or the Scientific Revolution, right? So as the guy said in the lecture, he met Galileo. Galileo was a great hero of Hobbes, the great scientist. René Descartes perhaps the father of modern skepticism, perhaps even the father of the modern Enlightenment theory, right? And the Enlightenment or the scientific revolution is just this notion that, we can explain the universe by applying the scientific method, right? If we use our methods correctly, we can apply, science to answer, the great problems that are in the world, right? So, here comes Newton, with his theory of quantum mechanics, right? And you got Galileo, and you have all these great scientists who attempt to solve the problems. Well, Hobbes is often credited as being the first social scientist, because Hobbes was trying to take, what Galileo was doing, what Descartes was doing, and trying to apply those principles to politics, right? So in some ways you could say, I suppose, that Hobbes was the first political scientist, right? Because he's trying to take these scientific principles and apply them to man and the way that man interacts with one another. So when you're doing science, right, you have hypotheses or you have axioms that you're starting from, right? So Hobbes says, okay, well, I'm going to conduct this thought experiment, right? Let's go back to the beginning. And let's think about what it is that actually drives human behavior, right? And Hobbes thought that there were two primary driving forces for human behavior. One was fear of dying, right, or fear of being diminished. And the other was pride, right? So I want to make myself look good. I want to gather these things to myself. And I want to bolster my fear by, accomplishing great things, right? So rather than Aristotle's view, this sort of positive view of human beings as trying to actually achieve something, for Hobbes, it was sort of a negative view, right? So rather than trying to achieve something, people are actually primarily trying to avoid death, right, and avoid fear. So rather than creating a state to achieve this human flourishing, Hobbes thought we needed to try to achieve a state that would actually, minimize our chances of this thing that we're afraid of, which is namely, death in this case, right? So anyway, so we have this sort of human society, and he posits, but this is sort of in the state of nature, in the absence of a legitimate, powerful government, right? So we're all out there. And Hobbes says that we all have one, essentially natural right. And it goes back to, biology in a lot of ways, right? What is the first law of nature? Self-preservation, right? So Hobbes says, okay, that's what we got. We're in the state of nature. We have this right to self-preservation, the right to life, as it's enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, right? So we have this right to self-preservation, but for Hobbes that creates a problem, right? Because he says, well, what does it mean to have a right to self-preservation? What does that actually entitle you to? Because what's self-preservation for me may be different than what is self-preservation for you, right? And we may have different needs. So you keep following this trail on, and it turns out that everybody has a right to everything, right? Anything that can legitimately be argued as a component of self-preservation, everybody's entitled to it. So you're living in a society where everybody is entitled to everything, right? And when you're living in a society where everybody's entitled to everything, that's how Hobbes gets to this notion of the state of war, right? So let me really quickly here pull up a passage from Leviathan about state of war. One second here. Okay. All right. He says, in this state of war, where everybody's entitled to everything, in such condition there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. Right? And here's his famous saying, in the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Right? So that's what the state of nature ultimately leads us to when everybody is entitled to everything. right? So you have this state of war, right? And he says, even if it's the case that, as some people argue later, most people are generally good and they're not going to, try to kill somebody else. He says there are going to be some people who come along, some bad people, right, who are going to ruin it for everybody. And he calls them the vainglorious or the prideful, right? They're going to come along and they're going to try to, take over, right? Because there's no power. And going back to Thrasymachus, where the strong take what they can, right? And as I'm reading Hobbes, I've been watching for the past several years. I've been watching the show The Walking Dead, right? And you see this, post-apocalyptic world where essentially it seems very much like what Hobbes is describing with the state of nature, right? Where there is no legitimate authority and people do whatever they think they can get away with, right? So you have this constant struggle. But the interesting thing, at least in this show, and I don't want to go too far off track, is that you see the main characters, the protagonists, constantly struggling with this notion, right? So even though it seems like there are no rules and there's a new society and new laws put into place, they still can't quite bring themselves to be like everybody else, right? And that's the central tension in the entire show is, does the main character, Rick Grimes, and his group, do they devolve into this, sort of dog-eat-dog kind of persona? And you see time and time again the struggle against that. So anyway, I think that's interesting in the face of, in the face of the world that they're living in, and maybe what that tells us about human nature. Or perhaps it just tells us about human nature in the face of being conditioned to grow up in, in the United States, right, during that time. Anyway, okay, so state of nature devolves into the state of war, right? So what's Hobbes' solution? Right? Well, Hobbes' solution is that everybody comes together, and everybody you have a right to everything, right? So what you have to do is you have to surrender your rights to everything, right? You surrender your rights to everything to this artificial body, this artificial construct that's created by the people, right? So oftentimes we think of it as a monarch, but it's not necessarily a monarchy. It could be an oligarchy, it could be a democracy, etc. But you're giving all of your power as individuals, everybody's giving their power to one body, right? One governing body, which he calls the Leviathan, right? The Leviathan is the state. It's the state where all the legitimate authority actually resides, right? That's given to it by the people. And by surrendering, all of your authority, all of your rights to this body, you're allowing this body to provide stability and security that will enable all these things that Hobbes says can exist in the state of nature. So you can have things like industry, you can have things like culture, you can have things like art, because you don't have to worry about your neighbor constantly killing you, right? Because if you give your authority and the power, right, because that's what comes along with it, right? You give your authority, therefore the state has the ability to levy taxes, right? So they're taking money. They're taking money from you. When they take money, that means they can build an army, right? So if they build an army, that means, and a police force. That means that if your neighbor kills you, police comes through, either imprisons or kills your neighbor, right? So in this case, there is a fear of reprisal that does not exist in the case of the state of nature. So it's this fear of reprisal that actually keeps people in check, according to Hobbes, right? So that's essentially, how we get out of it. Right? But of course there are a lot of problems with this because, Hobbes thinks that the people need to give the Leviathan, the sovereign, unlimited and undivided power, right? So the sovereign can do no wrong as the Leviathan, right? He has ultimate authority and he can't be wrong, right? He, she, it, whatever, right? The Leviathan can do no wrong because it has all the authority. But as we've seen over time, right, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So, just as Aristotle was talking about, monarchy and things like that when he was talking about the different types of constitution and the politics, he says monarchy can be great when you have a just ruler, a ruler who rules with virtue, and it's absolutely the worst form of government. Absolutism is the worst form of government when you have somebody in power who does not live life or doesn't rule through the virtues, right? So, but Hobbes would make the sort of counter to that by saying that is still better than living in the state of nature where none of this other stuff can happen, right? So that's sort of his ultimate conclusion, is that even under an absolutist government, that is much better than living in the state of nature, where everybody, everybody is at war with everybody, all are at war against all, right? So, okay, let's see, what else? Yeah, right. So, in that case, that means that Hobbes has a reciprocal. He believes there is a reciprocal relationship between obedience and peace, right? So, if you want ultimate peace, you have to be ultimately obedient, right? And the less obedient you are, the more war or the more conflict there's going to be, right? So it's interesting. Benjamin Franklin, famously said one time, the person who is willing to sacrifice freedom for security doesn't deserve either. So I don't know. Something to consider when you're thinking about that. Okay, so what are some of the objections to sort of Hobbes's notion of surrendering your rights to a legitimate authority, and this notion that people are going to pursue their own self-interest and that they're not going to cooperate, and having rights to everything is going to lead us into the state of war? Well, one thing is that this might be true if people were sort of like, if people came into the world as full-grown rational adults, right? Rational thinkers, right? They may actually come to this conclusion. But the truth is that people don't come into being that way, right? People are born, right? And then they become children. And being a child actually means that you've already experienced some kind of obedience to an authority figure, right? So right away you're understanding that actually collaborating with other people and being obedient to other authority figures is actually beneficial. So this notion that every human being is a rational actor and that they're always going to do what's best for them without the consideration of cooperating with somebody else is not entirely true, right? Because people are not, they don't come into the world that way. They're born into family structures. So family structures is one potential objection to Hobbes's position. Another objection is that people have affection for other people, right? We have friends, we have spouses, we feel sympathy towards other people. And people say that, Hobbes's account doesn't really take that doesn't take that fully into account. And the final thing is, and this is something we're going to talk about with Locke, is this notion that, Hobbes believes that if people are left to their own desires, they're free to pursue whatever they want in a society, that it's going to lead to the state of war. When in fact, some later theorists have actually argued that, capitalism, right? If people are left to their own devices and free market and things like that, then the invisible hand, I guess it's not invisible, the invisible hand is actually going to move things the way that they should be as a whole, right? So this idea of laissez-faire economics, laissez-faire politics, would argue that by letting people do what they freely want to do, you're going to arrive at the best possible society. So anyway, those are three objections to Hobbes's notion of how the state of nature leads to a state of war, and why perhaps we shouldn't just surrender all of our rights to the Leviathan. Okay, so this week we're looking at Locke, who is actually going to take some of Hobbes's principles and actually try to form a liberal democratic type of government out of what Hobbes has actually come up with. So he's taking Hobbes, his authoritarian government, and trying to transform it into something perhaps a little bit more recognizable to us. Okay, don't forget to participate in your new discussion groups, and I will try to get your midterms graded as soon as possible. Have a good week.